Chapter 990. The documentary, Soldier Goes Home, was produced by the Golden Star Film Studio. It was the latest work of the great director by zeeming after the new journey of mankind. After it was broadcasted on the Federation News Channel, it immediately set off a ratings frenzy. Although it was considered too sentimental and vulgar by some sharp and mean critics, this documentary was still nominated for many important awards in the Nebula Awards. However, it certainly could not break the record of his most famous documentary. However, two documentaries were nominated for the Nebula Awards at the same time. This was already a record that was difficult for future generations to reach. One night, a man and a woman who had been engaged in private for a long time, but had been separated for even longer, met again in the woods beside Robbie Avenue. They gave each other gifts that represented their feelings. The man's gift was a bottle of Polonia red wine, and the woman's gift was a bracelet. Jian Shuayer took off the bracelet with a smile and hung it on Su Li's wrist. It nestled together with the bracelet. The silver light reflected on each other, and a few lines of small words could be clearly seen. Su Lu looked at the face that was still beautiful, but more charming than before. He awkwardly raised the wine bottle and said, "I didn't know what to give you. You said on the battleship that it was your first blind date. At that time, you drank several bottles, so I chose this." Jian Shuayer smiled and walked forward into his arms. She hugged his strong waist and leaned against his chest. She whispered, "At that time, I thought the wine was a bit bland, but I like it now." Su Lu lowered his head and gently kissed her lips. At the moment of contact, he remembered that this love was really dreamy. It was even as unreal and fleeting as a dream. Because of the twists and turns of fate, the two of them didn't have time to enjoy the taste of love. But what was love? Was it the feeling of being moved? He had been moved before, and was still moved. Whether it was hugging, kissing, or just looking at her, his heart would beat faster. It was just like when he first saw the lonely nanny on TV outside the tavern when he was a child. It was just like when he saw the purple-haired female captain for the first time night after night. It was just like when he saw the real her for the first time at the concert in Linhai State Gymnasium. It was just like when he woke up from a dark dream and saw the sun shining through her white dress into her tube top. It was just like when he hugged her tightly for the first time in the stuffy cockpit. They walked hand in hand through the woods by the Boulevard Robbie and entered the still brightly lit Supreme Court of the Federation. The Supreme Court of the Federation never heard cases at night and had no duty to witness marriages, but today the Supreme Court of the Federation was waiting for a couple. There were very few people in the Supreme Court. There were no relatives, friends, or news reporters, other than the old man sitting at the chief judge's seat. There were only two staff members in charge of taking photos and archiving. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the Federation, He Ying, sat there drowsily, giving off a sense of oppression. He was truly an old man who could use time to suppress great power. Su Lu held Jian Shuayer's hand and said seriously, "A simple wedding cannot be made public and can only be held at night. It is indeed not grand and formal enough. I hope there will be a chance to make up for it in the future." Jian Shuayer smiled and said, "I have experienced too many grand and formal occasions over the years." The old judge in the courtroom suddenly opened his eyes and quickly woke up from his drowsy state. He looked at the man and woman below the courtroom and scolded unhappily, "Holding a ceremony in the Supreme Court with the Chief Justice of the Federation as the witness of the marriage. Is this not grand and official enough?" The judge, whose face was full of age spots, stared coldly at Su Li's face as if he was looking at scum. He said with an old voice, "The Supreme Court has never done a wedding ceremony before, so I am not familiar with the procedure. Of course, if you do a few more weddings in the future, perhaps we will be more familiar with it." This was obviously a severe accusation against someone's moral standards, but Sulu could not refute it. For some reason, he even heard a hint of killing intent, so he lowered his head like a criminal. The judge said indifferently, "There is another problem. One of you is from the Federation, and the other is from the Empire. How are you going to get married? The marriage law of the Federation has an additional clause for marriage with Bermuda, but there is no additional clause for marriage with the Empire." Sulu was stunned. He scratched his head and said awkwardly, "Do I have to find a way to let the Federation pass a resolution to allow marriage between the Federation and the Empire? Idiot, can't you say that you are from the Federation?" The judge looked at him as if he was looking at a stupid pig and scolded without any trace of politeness. "Where is the IQ of a genius engineer?" "But I am indeed from the Empire," Sulu replied very honestly. "You can keep your Empire citizenship." Sulu looked at the judge in shock and said, "You can do that? If I say you can do that, then you can do that." The old judge said angrily, "Who in the Federation dares to question my jurisprudence? There was no dual citizenship in the past, but there will definitely be in the future." Sulu took a deep breath and felt his body suddenly relax. He silently said to that fellow in the official residence, "In the end, I've been recognized as a member of the Federation." The ceremony entered the formal part. Judge Hiying, wearing his reading glasses, looked at the template that had just been downloaded from the internet and read it word by word. "Citizen of the Federation, Sulu, are you sure that you love Jian Shue'er and want to take her as your wife?" "Yes." Sulu held Jian Shue'er's hand and replied, "When I was very young, I told myself that I wanted to take Jian Shue'er as my wife." After the ceremony ended, Jian Shue'er went to the side to take a single registration photo. Only Sulu remained in front of the judge's stand, and he couldn't help but feel somewhat nervous. There were too few people in the world that could make him nervous, and the chief judge on the stand was definitely the first. He didn't understand why, but he recalled a proverb he had learned from the old thing before the great calamity: "One can be strong without desires." The reason why he revered the chief judge was probably because he had always stood on the side of selflessness to help him. "Sulu, come to the stand," the old judge said. Sulu obeyed and walked to the front of the stand. "I'm warning you, if you dare to ask me to hold a wedding ceremony for you with another woman in the future, I will immediately fall out with you." The old judge's wrinkles were filled with undisguised intimidation, but in the next moment his expression instantly became complicated. He said softly, "Of course, I also know that all men are like this. As long as you don't ask me to hold a wedding ceremony, I'll pretend that I didn't see it. Why did I insist that you keep your Empire citizenship? Because the people of the Empire can marry many wives." Unfortunately, Jian Shue'er had just returned at this time. When she heard this, the beautiful bride raised her eyebrows slightly. She looked at the banquet and said angrily, "Old man, do you not want to listen to my story anymore? You're already over 100 years old, and you're still so reckless." The old judge laughed awkwardly, and then said seriously, "Who said I'm over 100 years old? I'm only 95 this year. Have you ever heard of the saying, 738,495? I'm a dying man, so what's the point of being angry with me? Be good, and continue your stories tomorrow." At this moment, he glanced at his watch and patted his chest with some lingering fear. "It's past 12. My birthday is over. I'm officially 96 years old. It seems that I won't die so easily." Sulu looked at the old judge on the stand and said very sincerely, "When you decided the Zhong family property case, I already wished you a long life. This wish is too insincere." The old judge waved his hand and said, 100 years is too short. Some people thought that 100 years was too short, while others thought that 100 years was too long. In the canteen of Qingcheng military prison, a dark-skinned, middle-aged prisoner was giving a lesson to other prisoners. He waved his arms, and his deep voice sounded very persuasive. The former president of the Federation, Pabre, who had been sentenced to a long term of imprisonment, was still resolutely continuing his struggle. We are prisoners, but we still have relevant personal rights. For example, the right to not wear electronic shackles. This action by the prison seriously violates the Anti-Torture Act of the Federation. We have the right to receive guests, and we should also fight for our own political rights. The old prisoners who were still alive looked at him indifferently. Someone said mockingly, "The people here either have a reprieve or an indefinite sentence. What's the use of fighting for those rights?" Pabre looked at that person with a smile and said, "How can it be useless? It's always more comfortable to not wear shackles. Now there are more newspapers and magazines that everyone can read. I can even stand here and give lessons to everyone. We have to fight for our own rights." An old prisoner in the corner said with a hoarse voice, "That's fine. Mr. President, you've indeed fought for a lot of benefits for us. But what's the use of political governance? It's better to ask the prison management to give us some pornographic CDs. What's that called? Sexual rights, right?" A burst of ear-piercing laughter rang out in the canteen. Pabre also laughed and said, "Political rights are the right to vote. Although we don't have many votes, it's very likely that they are the most important votes. If we have the right to vote, we can vote for those who support the idea of leniency or those who believe that the prison budget should be cut and the number of prisoners should be reduced. Then maybe there will be pornographic magazines sent to prison one day. Maybe there will even be a day when you can walk out of prison." The prison gradually quieted down. The sinister old prisoners seemed to have started to think seriously. The bell rang. Under the close watch of the military police, Pabre was escorted back to a solitary cell. According to the schedule, he did 20 consecutive prostrations and drank a glass of water. Then he sat back at the table and began to write letters to the members of parliament at all levels. His gaze moved from the fiber letter to the picture frame in front of the table. In the picture frame, Pabre was looking at him with a sweet smile. Pabre smiled slightly. He silently calculated in his mind how many days it would be until the visiting date and how many years it would be before he could be released from prison. During the negotiations between the Federation and the Empire, it was claimed that there was a temporary truce. In fact, there were still conflicts on the surface of some planets. In order to fight for chips at the negotiating table for their side, no side would choose to wait in silence at this time. In a military camp, dozens of soldiers surrounded the major battalion commander, who had just led them through the encirclement and safely returned home. They expressed their gratitude at once. A subordinate asked curiously, "Battalion commander, are all the officers who were recruited through the special recruitment program of the Ministry of Defense as fierce as you? They even dared to climb down such a steep cliff." The battalion commander said with a cigarette in his mouth, "I used to be in the Federation Investigation Bureau. I didn't receive military training. On the battlefield, as long as you can understand one sentence, you will be qualified." "What sentence?" "Except for life and death. It's all F***king nonsense." "Brilliant. Battalion commander. I also heard this sentence from someone else." "Who?" "Colonel Sulo." After a long silence, a soldier asked in shock, "Battalion commander, you know, such a big shot." The battalion commander spat out the bitter cigarette in his mouth, raised his chin, and said proudly, "Nonsense! Do I have to tell you that I have interrogated him?" Several of the Federation's top socialites, who were usually very proud, thought of the fawning smile of the logistics director of the Samlin United Bank and realized that the seemingly inconspicuous chairman of the club in front of them actually had a very deep background. One of them said with a fawning smile, "Sister Lulu, I didn't expect you to be so capable." Sister Lulu, who was wearing a backless dress, held a cigarette with 2 fingers. Looking at the cold faces of the crowd, a charming look suddenly appeared in her eyes. She said, "Nonsense! Do I have to tell you girls that I have slept with the crown prince of the empire?" Every once in a while, Dr. Jiang Wei, who would be beaten up for no reason when he was thought of by those men, finally couldn't bear this eternal torture anymore. He summoned his courage and walked into the inpatient building of the Army General Hospital. He entangled with a female nurse and cried bitterly, "My Huang Liniao, can you get off work and eat?" Li family's 7th young master, Li Xiaotong, walked over with a large bouquet of golden sunflowers in his hands. After succeeding Li Xiuzhu as the president of the Sanlin United Bank, the yin and cold aura around his body was even stronger than before. However, in front of that female nurse named Huang Li, the yin and cold aura around his body would mysteriously fade without washing away. It was probably because that year in that clubhouse he had forgotten the name of. When he first saw her, he saw her use her small hands to slap that heartless man to her heart's content. From the wind of her palms and the shadow of her fingers, he tasted the biting cold flavor that he liked the most, so it was hard for him to forget. Looking at the scene in front of him, Li Xiaodong's face became cold again. Huang Li cutely stuck out her tongue and took the sunflowers. She took his arm and walked to the elevator. When the elevator door was about to close, she couldn't help but look at Dr. Jiang Rui with great sympathy. Brother Zeng, who stood silently behind Li Xiaotong, didn't leave. Instead, he slowly walked toward Jiang Rui. His hair was already white, but it was still like a cold gun. She was a famous young female member of the Federation. She was still the elegant and charming leaf of Green Dragon Mountain. Her subordinates in the Parliament Mountain had all heard of that legendary story, but they had never heard her mention it. Occasionally, after a certain weekend, the waiter would see 2 red wine glasses and a jar of foam in the bathroom. She was Zhang Xiaoming. A strange professor came to Yue University. This professor's hair was messy like a bird's nest, his eyes were always bloodshot, and his body was extremely thin. He looked like an old rabbit that had slept for too long. This professor never hid the fact that he had lived in a mental hospital for a long time. He insisted that the real geniuses of the Federation were all locked up in the mental hospital by the government. He also insisted that his IQ was higher than Su Lu and Shang Qiu, the 2 legendary engineers put together, because he said that if his name was understood in ancient letters, it meant better person. He was Bateman. The Empire's army completely recovered the Mo Hua planet. The almost ruined Fiji city regained some signs of life. The miners and slaves who had been hiding in the cellars and attics for who knew how long finally crawled out. They were originally very worried that they would be attacked and hurt again by the stray soldiers, but they didn't expect that the army that entered the city would be exceptionally disciplined. That was because there was a beautiful girl leading the military police to patrol day and night. In this city that couldn't take any more damage, no matter how barbaric the army was, they were as obedient and pure as mice in front of this military police. This was because this was the military police directly under His Highness, and everyone in the Empire's military knew that this beautiful girl was His Highness' most trusted subordinate. Fiji was her hometown, Shed Kabdanovich was her grandfather, and she was Uzra. A battleship full of bullet marks landed in a military base somewhere in S3. A tall and sturdy young Federation general walked out. The muscles under his military uniform were filled with violent strength, as if they could tear his uniform into pieces at any time. The young general unceremoniously refused the invitation of the 3 military chiefs to dinner, and then drove a military off-road vehicle alone, speeding towards a certain deep mountain. On the road less than 400 kilometers before arriving at the mountain villa, he rushed into a toll booth that tried to collect money, smashed a vehicle charging station that tampered with the counter, broke the thigh bones of 4 robbers, crashed 17 expensive rides of rich kids who were racing on ordinary roads, and saved a girl who jumped into the lake in a wedding dress because of relationship problems. He also didn't hesitate to slap the girl twice in the face and refused to leave his name and any contact information. The tattered military off-road vehicle finally drove into the secluded villa in the mountain. The young general knocked on the door, but there was no answer. So he kicked open the heavy and solid alloy door without hesitation and walked up the stairs to the balcony on the 2nd floor. He looked at the middle-aged man who was playing the violin and said in a deep voice, "Are you really going to turn yourself into a poor and artistic middle-aged man?" Including the invincible Huai Chaoshu of the empire. There were not many people in the world who dared to speak to the middle-aged man in such a tone. Other than the small-eyed officer in the training base, there was probably only this young general with a violent temperament. It was because he had been invincible since he joined the army at the age of 12. It was because the golden stars on his mecha's legs represented his military exploits were modeled and dazzling. It was because he was the proudest successor of the 37th Constitutional Federation. It was because he was willing to sacrifice his lifespan to undergo electroshock stimulation in order to protect this federation. It was because his temper had always been this violent, and it was because he was Madman Li. At the edge of the balcony, the middle-aged man put down the violin in his hand. His expression was still as cold and calm as on the battlefield, as if he was still the famous general of the Federation who had dominated the constellation. However, he no longer wore his iconic sunglasses today and had changed into casual clothes. He smiled and said, "It's not that I've changed, but that I've always been an artistic youth. Now that I'm older, I've naturally become an artistic middle-aged man." Li Feng furrowed his thin brows, stared at him, and said, "What on earth are you thinking about?" "I'm not thinking about anything. Or rather, I've come back because I've thought things through." Li Feng's brows furrowed even tighter and sharper as he asked in a deep voice, "What have you thought things through?" The middle-aged man looked at him and said calmly, "A few years ago, Su Li's identity as a person from the Empire was exposed. In the wilderness beside the high-speed rail, when my troops were under orders to hunt him down, Su Lu once cursed at me furiously, 'You're the F***king person from the Empire.' In response, you mocked and cursed back, 'If Su Lu is a person from the Empire, then I'm a F***king woman.'" Li Feng's furrowed brows gradually smoothed out, and he asked in disbelief, "If you still hold this grudge, I'll apologize to you solemnly." However, the situation back then was different. Who would believe that he was a person from the Empire? That's right. Who would believe that? The middle-aged man suddenly laughed. Just like who would believe that my mother was really a person from the Empire, a woman from the Empire. Li Feng's eyes suddenly widened, and he could not believe what he had just heard. "I didn't understand before, but after seeing Su Lu return to the Federation, I vaguely understood. She probably wouldn't want to see me avenge her in this way. There was a woman from the Empire who had a miserable life. She was the descendant of a noble who had been cruelly purged in the Empire. She was conscripted into the military camp at the age of 7. At first, she was washing clothes for those stinky soldiers, and then at the age of 9, she was transferred to the fleet of the Westwoods Expeditionary Force. At that time, it would take almost 7 years for the Imperial Expeditionary Force to reach the West Woods. The vast universe, the unknown dangers, and the monotonous long years on the ship could easily drive people crazy. The low-level soldiers who did not have much education could barely hold on with the iron of discipline and the brainwashing of the Royal Disciplinary Group, but the nobles and even the royal officers who led the expeditionary force seriously lacked such self-discipline and other methods of discipline. Therefore, they needed alcohol, and they needed women even more. Therefore, before the expedition, they would deliberately bring very young female slaves, waiting for those young female slaves to gradually grow up in the long journey. The nobles liked this kind of taste. Of course, this was a serious violation of military discipline. The royal family of the empire even used the law of beheading as a severe warning. However, it still could not stop those noble officers from secretly bringing young female slaves onto the fleet. In the end, it even evolved into a practice of some very powerful nobles. The woman from the empire was such a young female slave. In the 7 long years of the long journey, she turned from 9 to 16, from a young girl to a bright young girl, and then, unsurprisingly, became the sex toy of a certain general. The Imperial Expeditionary Force arrived at Planet 5460 West Woods of the Federation. After a fierce battle, they occupied the northern hemisphere of the planet, and the girl was transferred to the ground. Almost half of her short teenage life was spent in endless darkness and humiliation. The Empire girl suffered silently, praying that the Creator would give her a relatively better future, that she could return safely to her hometown, and then marry a commoner who did not despise her. No, even if it was a lowly slave, as long as he did not beat her, it would be fine. However, after eavesdropping on the general who despised her for being a piece of wood and wanted to throw her into a military brothel, the Empire girl felt the unbearable darkness for the first time. She stole a pair of anti-cold military boots, wrapped herself in 3 layers of blankets, and took a dozen pancakes to escape from the Empire camp, crossing the long primeval forest in the ice and snow, and fled to the south. In such a cold and cruel environment, such a terrifying and gloomy road, the girl actually walked out of the primeval forest in such an incredible way and arrived at a place with human habitation. At that time, among the federal forces stationed at the front line, there was a unit of the 7th Mechanic Division from the 2nd Military Region. There was an officer in the 7th Mechanic Division, surnamed due he met the thin and weak girl who was about to die from the cold and the snow at the edge of the forest. He knew that she was from the Empire, but he could not bear to hand her over to the intelligence agency because she was just a poor girl who was about to die. So, Officer Dew built a small tree house for her in the forest and moved in a warm bedding. Every few days, when it was his turn to patrol at night, he would hide the rations that he had saved for several days and send them to the treehouse. Occasionally, when he had time, he would even make small talk with hand gestures. Just like that, a low-level officer of the Federation and a low-level military brothel of the Empire fell in love with each other on the planet full of traces and smoke because love was simple in the first place. Love was such a simple and beautiful thing. The Empire girl, whose body was gradually recovering, felt happy for the first time in her life. She began to hum the songs of her hometown and wait for the arrival of the figure in the treehouse every day. She began to learn a few simple words in the Federation language. She began to pick up straight branches in the forest, then peeled off the bark and polished it with stones. She ate the mutton that the man caught, spun the wool of the mutton, and knitted a sweater for the man. Officer Dew was a man with a dull temperament. He only knew how to find the thickest branch he could carry so that the treehouse could be stronger. He only knew how to pick up the linoleum so that the woman would be warmer when she was waiting for him. He only knew how to steal a lot of old newspapers so that the woman could have something to do when she was bored. However, he forgot that she did not understand the language of the Federation. Many times, he could not walk out of the military camp, so he kept writing in his diary with a pen. He wrote down the bits and pieces after he met her, recorded the gradual growth of the treehouse, and recorded the difficult process of making the sweater. Finally, he began to record the appearance of his first child growing in her arms. He kept the diary very well and locked it so that no one would know about it. 10 months passed peacefully just like that. When the child was about to be born, the Empire girl had difficulty giving birth because of the pain and suffering she had suffered for many years. Looking at the woman moaning in pain in the treehouse with sweat all over her face, Officer Dew did not hesitate at all. He gritted his teeth and ran to the military camp. He did not care that he would be severely punished by military discipline. He only cared that she had to live. However, it was in that night full of blood and death that the final battle of the Second Federation defensive battle broke out. 3 Empire regiments violently attacked the defense line where the 7th Division was stationed. The 7th Division's headquarters missed the opportunity, leading to a fatal flaw in the federal military plan, and the 7th Division itself was surrounded by 3 Empire regiments. That battle was particularly tragic for the 7th Division. There was no military doctor, no military discipline, and not even a superior. Officer Dew could not find anything but corpses all over the mountains. In the early hours of the morning, when he risked death to return to the treehouse, the child had already been born. She used her teeth to bite off the bloody umbilical cord. She placed the child in her naked arms, but she had closed her eyes forever, so the newborn cried sadly and powerlessly. Not many people in the 7th Division survived that battle, and Officer Dew was one of them. He took the child back to the Capitol Ring on a battleship and reported that the child was an orphan he found in the home of the pioneering immigrants in 5460. The child's parents were already dead. Because of the need for publicity, the 7th Division became the Hero Iron 7th Division, but Officer Dew chose to retire with the child in his arms. Then, a few years later, he left the world with endless guilt and fear. Mixed bloods were often outstanding, and this was even more so for those of the Federation and the Empire. As the child grew up, he gradually revealed his own excellence. He entered the Capital University-affiliated high school, graduated first, and entered the Federation's first military academy. He studied hard and lived seriously because he heard his father talk about that battle when he was young. He knew that the honor of the Iron 7th Division was a shame that his father could never bear. He always thought that his father died of depression because of that tragic victory. When he returned home in his first year of college, he accidentally saw the diary left by his father. He read it all night and was shocked by the words. After that, he cried and never cried again. He finally knew that the shame in his father's wrinkles was not only because he was ashamed of his dead comrades, but also because he was ashamed of his mother who died in childbirth. He finally knew that his mother was a lowly military prostitute of the Empire. Who would look down on their mother? He would not. Although he felt a little inferior after that, he was more proud of his mother, who could cross the primeval forest in the wind and snow with a blanket and a pancake. That was his most amazing mother. As a result, he studied harder and harder, and his performance became more and more outstanding. There was once a girl in school who secretly expressed that she liked him, and he also silently liked her. However, he never responded to her feelings until he saw her holding the hand of another equally outstanding man. He did not respond because of that little bit of inferiority and that little bit of pride in his bones. More importantly, it was because he knew in his heart that his life was dedicated to the dangerous battlefield. It was very likely that he would die in the war between the Federation and the Empire. He wanted to clear the name of his father who died of depression and let the Iron 7th Division obtain true glory. He wanted to avenge his mother, who had lived a miserable life. He wanted to lead the army into the Empire and destroy that evil world. He wanted to turn all the nobles of the Empire and that dog of an emperor into dogs at his feet. In order to accomplish this goal, he joined the Trinity Association and began to follow Pa Bray. He wanted to turn the Federation into a powerful military machine that could directly crush the Empire's enormous body. Therefore, he was cold and unapproachable. He was indifferent and no longer moved. However, all of this ended at the hands of the Empire's prince, who he should have hated the most, but found that he could not bring himself to hate him. Then he suddenly realized that the world in his eyes was gradually changing. On the final battlefield of planet Mo-Hua, for the first time, he noticed the Empire's little girls crying as they ran between the Empire's towns and cities. His mother should have been such an Empire's little girl back then, right? After the first failure, or rather the first time he voluntarily retreated, he chose to leave the battlefield and resign from his position as the Federation's enemy commander-in-chief. He returned to his hometown of S3 and bought an ordinary villa in the mountains. He played a melodious violin on the terrace and missed the things that never belonged to him, his woman. He missed his father and his mother from the Empire. He was Du Shaoqing. Chapter 991. There was a place called Foothill Vocational School beside a certain mountain path in the Capital Special District. It was not authorized to issue diplomas, but it had become the most difficult vocational school to enter in the Federation. This vocational school had never advertised what students wanted to learn and had never conducted public recruitment. It was very difficult for ordinary students to enroll in the school because the school had a learning process every year. Every year, 100 students were admitted. Half of the students from the Eastwoods district were admitted, while the Westwoods district was given a third. More importantly, it was rumored that the 3 major motor companies of the Federation did not conduct any tests on the graduates of this school and would directly hire them with high salaries. The reason why Foothill Vocational School was so popular and difficult to enter was not only because of the certification given by the 3 major motor companies, but also because the school had more than 10 excellent mechanical and electronic experts. More importantly, this school had a very famous honorary principal. It had been a month since the school started in spring this year. The students who were excited because of the rumors did not see the honorary principal and could not help but doubt the authenticity of the rumors. A mixture of restlessness and disappointment finally broke out this morning. The students of the Foothill Vocational School walked to the playground in an orderly manner, holding up the slogans written with ink on the bedsheets, announcing that they would go on strike. They waved their fists angrily at the vocational school and roared in their childish or unpleasant voices, "Hey! We want to see the principal. We want to see the honorary principal. We strongly protest against unfair treatment. We demand the same benefits as the students in the early stage. We want to see Jian, sure. We want to see Jian Shuier." Hearing the clamor and slogans, several security guards walked out of the security room beside the field. These security guards were usually there, smoking, drinking, and playing cards every day. They looked like a pile of old junk. The students were not afraid at all and looked at them contemptuously. The security guards were honest and did not threaten them verbally. Instead, they directly pulled out the crooked batons behind their waists and rushed toward the black mass of students. Pa, 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 pa. At first, there were still some strong students who tried to organize their companions to resist, but they didn't expect that the seemingly useless security guards would only send out 3 people to beat everyone up. In less than 5 minutes, there were 100 groaning students lying on the field. Motherf asterisk cur. No, Motherf asterisk cur. Don't forget, you brats. When you entered the school, you all signed the military regulations. If it was on the battlefield, all those years ago, I wouldn't have just beaten all of you until your heads bled. I would have broken all of your bones and broken all of your eggs. A tall and sturdy middle-aged man stroked the faintly visible white buzz cut on the top of his head. His face was ferocious, fierce, and cold. He raised the baton in his hand and roared, Remember this. Our school is not only famous for its honorary principal, but our security department is also very famous. Get a division and fight with me." Bai Yulan, who had been silently watching from the side, smiled slightly. She reached out and gently lifted the strands of hair in front of her forehead. She whispered to Xiong Linquan, who was still in a state of rage, "How old are you? Why are you still so hot-tempered?" Xiong Linquan threw away the baton, tugged at the crumpled security uniform on his body, and walked back indignantly. He said, "Every year, I hear different bastards shouting that they want to see Jian Shui'er. She is our sister-in-law. Who wouldn't be angry?" Bai Yulan looked down at her old military watch and said, "It's time." The honorary principal of the Foothill Vocational School, Jian Shui'er, was indeed not here. She was now on the Federation's battleship heading to the Zhuo-Tian starfield as the honorary captain of the newest model of the Federation's battleship enterprise. She was on a mission much more important than satisfying the impulse of the students to chase stars. The second round of negotiations between the Federation and the Empire was about to officially begin. The national idol girl of the past suddenly became the Federation's negotiating representative. As the deepest thorn in the heart of Emperor Huai Fuchai, she took the initiative to ask to be the negotiating representative. She wanted to see where the Empire's bottom line was. In addition to judging the sincerity and bottom line of the other party, Jian Shui'er also wanted to take a last look at her father's second hometown, her first hometown. She also wanted to see the princess that she had never seen before. She wanted to know the feeling of sisters hugging each other. The official principal of the Foothill Vocational School, Ms. Nan Xiangmei, walked into the large conference room and looked at the wailing students with medical bandages. She couldn't help but cover her mouth and laugh. Her beautiful face had a moving expression. "It's understandable that everyone wants to see a celebrity," she gently said to the students below. "The physics guest professor that I specially invited for everyone today is a real celebrity." The students actually liked this beautiful and gentle principal very much. The reason why they went to the playground and clamored to see Jian Shui'er was not only because they were really curious about the celebrity who had retired for many years but was still the main topic of their parents' dinner table gossip, but also because of the impulsiveness of adolescent boys. However, when they heard the principal's words, they almost made a scene. They thought that such a lousy school had the nerve to talk about a guest professor, but they suddenly remembered the security guards, so they didn't dare to make a noise. The physics guest professor who will be teaching you today is an independent director of the Shell Motor Company, one of the two main designers of the MX series mecha, and the youngest member of the Federal Academy of Science. Nan Xiangmei seriously read out these prefixes, and then looked at the dead silent students with satisfaction. She gently smiled and said, "Let us warmly welcome teacher Shang Qiu." Shang Qiu walked in from outside the classroom. She was still wearing her full-rimmed glasses. Her messy hair was casually tied behind her head with a pencil, and she was wearing a nutshell overalls. She looked like an engineer who had just left the field. She looked at the students below the stage and smiled casually. She directly opened the teaching materials and said with her head down, "I'm very busy, so I only come to help occasionally every 1 or 2 months. So what the guest professor said is not wrong. If there's something you don't understand, don't ask me. I don't have time to answer you. Go look up the teaching materials yourself, or continue to not understand." A very strong aura, a very confident and arrogant appearance. However, the students below the stage, who were in the rebellious phase of their youth, did not have any reaction. They were completely stunned. They looked at the female professor on the stage with their mouths wide open. As students who majored in mechanical engineering, of course they knew who Shang Qiu was. She was an existence who was as famous as Su Lu and was known as the god of mechanical engineering. Of course, she was a big celebrity. especially when she bowed her head. It was really big. On the other side, Principal Nan Xiangmei walked out of the classroom with the handbook in her hand. When she saw the middle-aged man holding a bowl of smashed instant noodles and eating, she couldn't help but frown. She sighed and said, "Boss Li Shaoshan, as the principal of the school, I have the responsibility to remind you. Since this is a school convenience store for students, can you stop selling wine to them in the future?" After hearing this sentence, Li Shaoshan, the owner of the Foothill department store, pretended to throw the bowl of instant noodles and said angrily, "Who surrounded my convenience store directly into the school with a wall? Then I can only become the convenience store of this shabby school. If you want me to stop selling wine, then ask Su Lu to come back and tear down this wall and let my store move out." Nan Xiangmei painfully covered her forehead. She didn't know why Su Lu insisted on enclosing that humble convenience store into the school, nor did she know what problems there were between the two men. She just didn't have the energy to deal with more problems. However, she didn't expect that just as she walked to the stairs, she was stopped by a man with an extraordinary temperament. The man smiled and asked, "Hello, are you Principal Nan Xiangmei?" "I am, but how did you get in?" Nan Xiangmei frowned and stared at him. She thought that the security guards, even if they were going to sweep the tombs, shouldn't they at least leave one person behind? "I entered your school with Shang Qiu," the man explained with a smile. Nan Xiangmei relaxed and asked doubtfully, "Why are you looking for me?" "Because I couldn't find Su Lu today. I have a few words to ask Principal Nan Xiangmei to pass on to him. Please tell him that I am the groom who lost his bride when he returned from the Empire, and I have officially joined the 4 departments of Green Dragon before the new year. If he still doesn't let go of Shang Qiu and is unwilling to take responsibility, then I will pursue Ms. Zhang Xiaoming." Nan Xiangmei covered her mouth and looked at him with appreciation. She praised, "This move is really ruthless and your intelligence work is really good. But you have to leave your name, right?" The man smiled and said, "Let me introduce myself. I am your cousin, surnamed Chao, named Juren. My father is Chao Qiudao, who left the Chao family very early." Hearing that name, Nan Xiangmei couldn't put down her hand that was covering her mouth. However, it was obvious that the trouble at the Foothill Technical School wasn't over. There was a cloud of smoke at the school gate, and more than a dozen dark green military vehicles roared in. The former members of Group 7 in the gatehouse dared to face dozens of armed Special Forces soldiers, but when they saw the little ancestor in the military vehicle at the front, they suddenly fell into a state of absolute silence. The commotion in the school was so big that even Shang Qiu couldn't help but come out. She and Nan Xiangmei stood side by the railings. When they saw the girl who jumped down from the military vehicle, they couldn't help but look at each other and signal for her to go. When they found that no one was stupid, they had to go down together. The girl who jumped down from the military vehicle was Zhong Huiyin. She specially came from the West Woods to the capital to attend the inauguration of the new president of the Federation. Naturally, it was impossible for her not to come here. After being the head of the Zhong family for many years, the beautiful girl in her 20s had now become a real beauty. However, the words mature and steady seemed to have nothing to do with her. 2 sisters-in-law, is that beast not in school? Shang Qiu and Nan Xiangmei frowned at the same time. Shang Qiu didn't care that she called Su Lu a beast, but she didn't want to be called sister-in-law. Nan Xiangmei was very happy to be called sister-in-law, but when she heard that Su Lu was a beast, she couldn't stand it and said angrily, "How can you say that your brother is a beast?" Zhong Huiyin pursed her lips and blew a breath, blowing the watermelon bangs on her forehead up. She said mockingly, "An imperial man has so many beautiful girls in the Federation. If he isn't a beast, then what is?" Nan Xiangmei was speechless. Zhong Huiyan smiled and walked in front of Shang Qiu. Without warning, she stretched out her index finger and slashed at Shang Qiu's bulging chest. Shang Qiu wasn't afraid of her at all, and she was already mentally prepared. She directly waved her hand and reprimanded, "You're a big girl now. Why are you still acting like a child?" "I'm just curious." Zhong Huiyan's eyes narrowed into two crescent moons, but her frowning eyebrows exuded endless unwillingness. She said bitterly, "Why can't my chest grow back?" Shang Qiu said calmly, "My chest is the same as my brain. They both belong to the category of geniuses." Zhong Huiyan reached out and lifted her bangs again and said angrily, "Even if I can't marry that beast, I'm still your sister-in-law. Can you be a little more polite? Don't always attack a girl's fragile self-confidence like this. And don't forget that I'm younger than you, and you're all going to be old soon. Well, I admit that you don't look old now, but you'll definitely be old before me." Then she turned to Nan Xiangmei and educated her. "Sister Nan Xiangmei, I also had a good time in your manor. I have to remind you that your temper is too weak. If you want to snatch meat from those guys who are like wolves and tigers, you have to be more ruthless." Without waiting for Shang Qiu and Nan Xiangmei to fly into a rage at the same time, Zhong Huiyan spread out her hands and asked innocently, "I just want to know where my brother went. Did anyone tell me?" There was an old temple in the mountainous area of S3. It had yellow eaves, columns, and walls, and the style of the former dynasty was very strong. Lady Tai, who was still wearing a light linen dress to cover her body, had a few more wrinkles at the corners of her eyes compared to before. She held a slender, sharp knife in her hand and cut the onions on the chopping board into pieces. Then she picked them up with her fingertips and sprinkled them evenly on the freshly fried lamb chop. Lady Tai suddenly felt very tired and murmured softly, "He won't take the medicine anymore, and he won't have a child. He has to leave. Then what's the point of all my hard work over the years? Who am I working hard for?" A hand reached out from behind her and took the plate of lamb chop sprinkled with onion shreds. The person laughed foolishly and said, "I still like to eat the lamb chop with scallions made by Mom." Lady Tai turned around and tightly hugged the young man who was taller than her and had a naive look in his eyes. She didn't know whether it was because of the onions or other reasons, but tears couldn't stop flowing from the corners of her eyes. She sobbed and said, "Even he has left these two heartless things." Outside a secret airport in the suburbs of the capital, looking at the black spaceship disappearing into the clouds, Su Lu subconsciously narrowed his eyes and touched his left wrist. There was only a bracelet on it, and the bracelet that Jian Shui gave him was gone. He murmured in a low voice, "They're all gone." Zhou Yu stood quietly beside him, gently playing with a red flower in her hand. "I don't know if they can find the ancestral planet. Although there is a star map now, that spaceship is definitely not as advanced as the spaceship of the past. The universe is vast and dangerous. Who knows what will happen in the next moment? We're all people who seek refuge from our ideals. It's really a beautiful thing to be able to take action for this before death comes." Su Lu looked at Bai Qi, who was crying in the distance. He looked at the legendary woman who had turned from a prostitute to the first lady of the Federation. He suddenly said, "When Lin Banshan finds out that he didn't catch up with this lousy spaceship, will he also cry and cut up Zhang Xiaohua and Han Chu?" Zhou Yu said, with his fanatical interest in the aesthetics of the universe, "It's very likely. The world was like this. Some people wanted to stay, some wanted to leave, some wanted to stay but were forced to leave, and some wanted to leave but had no choice but to stay." She looked at the red flower petals in front of her shoes and asked softly, "When are you leaving?" "Paul's wedding is in 20 days. I'll leave the day after tomorrow and come back in 2 months. Do you want to take people with you? Li Jaedu's remaining forces are now pirates in Bermuda. There's no need. Su Lu explained. The old thing is watching over the passage, so it should be fine. The passage is in the Empire's territory, so no one will be stupid enough to do anything to me. At this moment, a slightly flustered and proud voice suddenly sounded in his mind. Lulu, the old thing is gone. I'm in charge of the passage now. Su Li's body suddenly stiffened. He subconsciously looked at the sky, trying to find the trace of the broken spaceship, but it was nowhere to be seen. He asked in shock, Philip, you actually stayed. Didn't we agree? Why is the old thing controlling the spaceship? He also wants to see what the ancestral planet looks like now. Philip's tone became serious. Between the Federation and the Empire, only he has lived there and has memories. Su Lu was silent for a long time. Then he smiled and stopped thinking about it. Searching for one's most cherished memories was the most important right of every intelligent life. I'm just worried that the old thing will return the charter network to you. With your current frivolous personality, do you still have the ability to manage those trivial and boring jobs? What's so trivial and boring about it? Philip laughed. Lulu, that old guy, has been unwilling to take you along, so I'll take you along. Find a time to connect the two of us, and then I'll help you easily unify the universe. Su Lu replied in annoyance. Who would want to do that kind of thing? Philip was obviously stunned. Then he replied, awkwardly, I think your biological father, sister, and best friend all like to do it. So, it was Su Li's turn to feel awkward. He asked in confusion, what's wrong with your voice today? It feels like a human being who breathes in the air. Philip coughed twice in his mind and said with a strange shyness, after taking over the charter network, I made a difficult decision. Su Li's scalp went numb from this voice. What decision? I've decided to call myself Su Fei from today onwards. Very good. Little Watermelon will be very happy when she knows. I didn't change my name for her. Then who is it for? Of course it's for you. Huh. You don't understand. I really don't understand. The difficult decision I'm talking about is that, from today onwards, I've decided to become a woman. The image of a female housekeeper wearing a black dress appeared in his mind. The female housekeeper was unnaturally pulling at the dress, trying to adjust the straps more reasonably. Su Lu looked at her face that could only exist in his imagination, and was even more perfect than Jian Shui, looking at her exquisite body that could only exist in his imagination, and was even more attractive than Jian Shui, he was so shocked that his lips and tongue became dry. After a long time, he remembered to ask, why? The female housekeeper cutely held her waist and said charmingly, who asked you to always say that I'm not a man? Who asked you to give me a girl's name called Su Lu? Hung. After a moment of silence, Su Lu replied, this is indeed your freedom. The housekeeper smiled and then bowed deeply. She said in a delicate voice, actually, it's just that I feel that life is really beautiful, so I want to experience the most beautiful part of life in another way. I hope you can give me some advice. Su Lu understood the meaning of this sentence and asked in confusion, are you crazy? Zhou looked at him in confusion and asked, what's wrong with you? No one knew this conversation in his mind, but for Su Lu, who had the most nerves, it was still like being struck by countless lightning bolts, and he was crispy on the outside and tender on the inside. Facing Zhou question, he took a long time to calm down. He pointed to the motorcade in the distance and said in low spirits, little Watermelon is coming. Zhou shook her head slightly and said, seeing this little ancestor, no wonder you want to shout. In the black car heading to the Milky Way cemetery in the suburbs of the capital, Su Lu looked at Zhong Huiyan, who was hugging his arm like a koala and would not let go. He frowned helplessly and said, "You're already a big girl. Can't you be more sensible? I heard that you just attended the inauguration of the new president and beat up Lu Hua in front of Madman Li. Why? As a father, you feel sorry for him?" Zhong Huiyan looked up at Zhou Yu in the front row and asked, "Sister Yuzi, if you say that you feel sorry for him, I won't beat him in the future." Zhou Yu replied expressionlessly, "I don't care about you kids." Zhong Huiyan looked at the red flower in her hair and muttered something in a low voice. Among the opposite sex around Su Lu, she was most afraid of Zhou Yu for some reason. It was probably because Zhou Yu was always so charming, but her temperament was so indifferent. She could often turn all her probing attacks into nothing with just one sentence. "Continue talking about the beating. Don't change the topic." Su Lu reprimanded her. "Zhou Liuhua is asking for a beating. Brother, that guy took advantage of the fact that Madman is his godfather and showed off his fierceness everywhere in the venue. How old is he? It's fine if he's just showing off his cuteness, but how dare he show off his fierceness to me? That guy didn't think about it. My biological father is Madman's godfather, and you are his biological father on the household register. No matter from your side or Madman's side, I'm his godaunt. He dared to mess around in front of me. Isn't that asking for a beating?" Sula said, "When it's time to discipline people outside, you should discipline them." Zhong Huiyan found that he seemed to be a little uneasy, which was a very rare phenomenon. She couldn't help but ask in a low voice, "You don't look good. What happened?" After thinking for a moment, Su Lu glanced at Zhou Yu in the front seat and whispered in her ear, "Philip insisted that we call her Su Fei. That's pretty good. I gave her the name." Zhong Huiyan said in a low voice, "Our little girl has finally grown up." Hearing her reaction, Su Lu smiled and told her the words of the little girl. After a moment of dead silence, Zhong Huiyan angrily jumped up from her seat and screamed, "She's crazy! How dare she steal someone from me?" Zhou Yu in the front seat turned around and looked at the brother and sister, who were particularly strange today. She frowned. Many years later, the spaceship, which had experienced countless dangers, finally arrived at the ancestral planet that the star map pointed to. It arrived at the beautiful planet composed of blue seas, green forests, and white clouds. The black spaceship, which was even more shabby than when it first set off, broke through the atmosphere and, following the guidance of the detection equipment, landed on a mountain by the sea. This mountain was very strange. The side facing the sea was sparkling and smooth, like a piece of jade. Obviously, it had been melted by some kind of extreme heat in an instant. 3 people in heavy anti-radiation suits walked out of the black spaceship. They carefully stepped on the rocks of the mountaintop. The last self-propelled exploration vehicle creaked out. The self-propelled exploration vehicle quickly completed the particle collection and analysis. Then the mechanical voice of the old man sounded, "Warning! The radiation level in this area is seriously excessive. It will directly lead to death." "So what if I die? Can I go back to the forest alive? Even if I want to go back to this broken spaceship, I don't have the energy to fly back. To be able to see the ancestral planet with my own eyes, to be able to see such beautiful scenery, to be able to die here, what regrets do I have?" One of them directly took off his helmet. It was Uncle Feng Yu. However, with the passage of time, the face that seemed to never age had now experienced endless vicissitudes. Next to him, Master Empress also took off her helmet without hesitation. Countless wrinkles now appeared on her face, which was so handsome that all male animals would be jealous of her. He took a deep breath of the air on the mountain top and said, "Emotionally, I am different from the 2 of you. This planet is not only the ancestral planet of the human survivors, but also the homeland of the Hua family's ancestors. to be able to breathe a breath of the air of the real homeland. I think my ancestors would be proud of me. Tai Ziyuan did not take off his helmet. He asked his question in a weak voice. I have always been thinking, since your ancestors can survive on the ancestral planet, it means that the ancestral planet is now suitable for human survival. Then why is the radiation still so serious? Yes, Master Fan frowned and said, I have been exposed to radiation for so long and have breathed so much air. Why don't I feel anything? Uncle Feng Yu looked at the autonomous probe vehicle and said with a cold smile, then there is only one possibility, that trash computer miscalculated again. The old man's mechanical but unyielding voice rang out from the autonomous probe vehicle. If not for the trash computer, we would never have been able to reach this planet with the guidance of a trash who calls himself a genius. At the same time, I want to remind you that you have been driven away by me for decades. You really don't have much right to be proud in front of me. Catch me if you can, trash computer. Uncle Feng Yu mocked. Obviously, during the long journey through space, the spaceship was filled with such harsh and hostile discussions, so neither Master Fan nor Tai Ziyuan had any reaction. Speaking of which, Feng Yu, who had used his entire life to fight against the glory of the Charter, was actually spending the last moments of his life on the same spaceship as the Charter. The arrangement of fate was indeed strange. Tai Ziyuan took off his helmet, and then slowly took off his anti-radiation suit. His hair had already grown white, and his body was extremely thin. It was extremely difficult for him to complete these actions with his current weak body, but he still completed them slowly as if he was on a pilgrimage. Then he walked towards the cliff. It's really strange. He looked at the open sea below the cliff and breathed in the sea breeze. He murmured, not only do I not feel pain, but I feel very comfortable. Because I feel the same, so I am sure that you are not experiencing terminal lucidity. Feng Yu said indifferently. The old man explained with a mechanical voice. Maybe it's because you are also about to die. Master Fan coughed to stop Feng Yu from pushing the self-driving car down the cliff and burying it at sea. He gasped and said, one of you has lived for almost 100 years, and the other has lived for tens of thousands of years. Can you not quarrel like children every day? The self-driving car was silent for a moment, and then suddenly said, there is indeed a problem with the radiation here. It is very strong, but it doesn't seem to be harmful to the human body. On the contrary, it seems to be very beneficial. You can try to experience it carefully. Feng Yu slowly closed his eyes. The great teacher also closed his eyes. Then, the two of them opened their eyes and revealed an expression of shock and disbelief. They said at almost the same time, it's Shenqi. To them, this mountaintop was like a dense and abundant Shenqi. In almost an instant, they felt that their old bodies were filled with strength again. The fresh and touching scent of life was nourishing every cell in their bodies along with the moist sea breeze. Even Tai Ziyuan felt it. He squinted his eyes and looked at his hands that were no longer trembling. He discovered that the nerve discharge phenomenon in his brain had actually improved greatly. The three travelers, old and young, slowly walked to the side of the cliff. They looked at the open ocean, looked at the flying seabirds in the distance, and looked at the sails that had just entered their sight. They couldn't help but be touched by the fresh and natural aura that brought tears to their eyes. Master Fan praised with tears flowing down his face. Life, you are so beautiful. Please stop for a moment. The old man's mechanical voice sounded again in the self-driving car. This is Schiller's poem. Suddenly, another cold voice sounded. Faust, Goethe. The three of them turned around in shock. The great teacher looked in the direction of the voice. His body trembled violently and then stiffened. With a thud, he directly knelt on the ground and cried bitterly. Sitting on the other side of the cliff was a young man. It was unknown when he had appeared, but it also felt like he had been sitting there forever. He was wearing a simple but ancient black shirt. His face was covered with a black cloth that covered his eyes and covered the sky. Many years ago, the black car slowly drove through the Federation's Charter Square. He saw the bronze statue of the Group of Five and the statue of the military god Li Pifu. Then he went to Xinghe Public Cemetery. He placed a bouquet of white chrysanthemums in front of Professor Shun's grave. Su Lu carried a bottle of wine and walked to Shi Qinghai's grave. He quietly looked at the hooligan under the grave and suddenly said, "Since you died, I rarely drank the wine that others handed to me. If you hadn't been greedy for that glass, we could still drink together now." He opened the bottle of Wenjun brandy number 1 in his hand and slowly poured it into the soil in front of the tombstone. He smiled and said, "But if you weren't greedy for wine, you wouldn't be Mr. Shi. I don't know how you are doing over there. I'll pour more wine for you. Remember not to steal wine from others anymore." Zhou Yu and Zhong Huiyan came over and stood beside him. Zhong Huiyan wanted to hold his arm, but he inadvertently avoided her. Zhong Huiyan snorted and squatted down to look at the beautiful face on the tombstone. She murmured bitterly, "Young master, your friend is worse than a beast. If you were still alive, I would definitely find you as my boyfriend. He wouldn't even stand a chance." Zhou Yu picked the bright red flower in her hair and gently placed it on his tombstone. Su Lu looked at her side profile and remembered the unforgettable past. He couldn't help but smile and say, "Now that I think about it, the hooligan's marksmanship is really good. I'm not used to these boring jokes." Zhou Yu said. Su Lu said, "I don't know what you used to talk about when you were together. He and I were only together in Charter Square." After a moment of silence, Zhou Yu said calmly, "The path I walked with him in the square really wasn't long. Unfortunately, I knew he wanted to hear what I had to say, but I didn't say anything because I wanted to make the path longer." Zhong Huiyan stood up from the tombstone and looked at the two people quietly. Suddenly, she sighed softly. Su Lu didn't remain silent. Then he turned and left. "I finally know who he likes the most." Zhong Huiyan looked at her and said. Zhou Yu looked at the red flower that was blown off the tombstone by the mountain wind and fell on the mud. She smiled and didn't say anything. Xiong Linquan was here. Gu Shifeng was here. Zhu Er was here. Monkey was here. Jiang Jin was here. Lao Hu was here. Shi Hang was here. When she in a wheelchair was pushed up the mountain by Xiao Shui by Yulan was here. And all the living people were here. Then Group 7 was here. Taking out 2 packs of Blue Box 37 from his pocket, Su Lu gave cigarettes to his team members one by one and lit them up seriously. Everyone looked at the tombstones of Group 7 in front of them, smoking and discussing who should be buried next to in the future and who liked to snore when sleeping. Su Lu took a drag of the cigarette and watched the smoke slowly dissipate in front of him. He narrowed his eyes and smiled. Chapter 992. 1. I wrote 39,000 words in a day. I can't hope to break this record in my lifetime. I'm already exhausted at this time. When I enter middle age in the future, where will I find the hot-bloodedness and impulse to create? Yes, I can pretend to be cool and say that it's the impulse to create. Why do I say that? Because it is. It's the hot-bloodedness and the desire to pour out. 2. The final chapter is a beautiful thing. I love to point out the topic, so I wrote that chapter for a full 12 hours. I didn't even split my heart for a moment. 28,800 words. I originally wanted to write a chapter and set a personal record for the number of words in a single chapter. But unfortunately, the new version of Qijian is limited to 12,000 words per chapter. 3. If the plot of the final chapter conflicts with the previous chapter. And I'm saying if because my brain is muddled, I can't think of any conflicts. If there is, please use the final chapter as your starting point. The reason is simple. I wrote the final chapter with the most energy and spirit, so I wrote it the best. 4. I really like the story of Du Shaoqing's parents. If anyone is interested, I'm happy to expand it. I want to write, but don't have the energy. In fact, I didn't want to write this story. I wanted to put it in the outer chapter or just casually mention it at the beginning. But last night, I realized that if I don't put this kind of story that I like in the most important final chapter, I'm sorry for myself. 5. I'm going to eat something and sleep. I'm going to YY at 8:30 p.m. to talk about this book. The channel number is 55373. But please be considerate. If I really can't get up at night, then there's nothing I can do. When the time comes, I'll try to ask for leave in advance. Anyway, you're used to this lazy cat asking for leave. 6. I'll definitely write the epilogue, but I definitely can't in the next few days. I'll definitely write it when I'm in the right state of mind and have the time. There's still a lot I want to say. 7. At least I'm not a lazy cat today. I'm so moved by my own diligence that I couldn't stop crying. More importantly, I'm very satisfied with the content of these 39,000 words. 8. A person must have a beginning and an end. A month is a cycle. A book is a cycle. Since the beginning, I've been calling for votes. There were many days in between that I didn't call for votes. Today is the last day, so I have to shout. I want monthly votes. I want recommendation votes. I want subscriptions. I want review votes. I want pink votes. As long as you can vote, I dare to take it. Even if you give me an update vote, I'll take it. Even if I know it's for free. Thank you. Go to bed with a big heart.